Just two things real quick before getting started here. First of all, I was trying a new recording method for this episode. So if this is your first time here, usually the audio doesn't quite sound like this. There is a reasonable amount of background noise in this. I was trying to see if I could take a microphone and record while driving on a trip. I considered re-recording this episode, but ultimately decided that, I said what I wanted to say in the episode, and I think that it, covers the things I wanted to talk about. It's not horrible, right? It's just not usually where things are. I did try some editing methods to remove some of the background noise. They only work to a certain extent. So in the future, I have some ideas on how to maybe make this work better in the future. But if this is kind of your first time here, normally this is not quite how the audio sounds. I try to keep things cleaner, kind of like you're hearing now. But I just wanted to put that out there. So, a little bit of, just give me a little bit of patience through this one. I hope you enjoy it. Secondly, I do want to mention, because I don't think I say it in the episode, this does contain spoilers. Not tons of them, but a decent, I do talk about things that occur throughout the season and the finale for Stranger Things Season 5. So if you haven't seen that, and you don't want spoilers, you probably don't want to listen to this, or you can come back later and listen. But anyway, thanks, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Trying something a little different today. I don't know. We're going to see how it goes. Also having some early morning coffee, not late morning. I want to talk about Stranger Things. I have some thoughts. First of all, I want to say a couple things at the top. First of all, I had an absolute blast. This was the first... There aren't many shows that I remember in my lifetime. And if it wasn't in my lifetime, there weren't many before my lifetime either. There haven't been a lot of shows that sort of bring this cultural presence along with them in the way that Stranger Things did. I can think back to... I can probably count them on one hand, the ones that I can really think of. I can think of Game of Thrones is probably the one in most recent memory. Before that, I could probably make an argument for The Sopranos, Seinfeld, maybe Friends, maybe. But by the time Friends wrapped up, first of all, it was a sitcom. And second of all, I think that, the last season or the last few episodes of Friends kind of weren't doing much anyway. But anyway, maybe Friends. And I love Friends, by the way. It's just that the finale didn't feel as culturally massive as some of these other things. Seinfeld probably fit into this category. And then I always heard stories about MASH, like the finale of MASH being such a big deal. I've never seen MASH. I don't know much about MASH. I wasn't alive, I don't think, during the finale. I don't even know when the finale was. But those are the ones that I can think of, sort of in order. I guess there was MASH, Seinfeld, Friends, Game of Thrones, and Sopranos. Although you have to reverse those last two, but whatever. My point is there aren't many, right? There are not many shows that manage to survive with such a cultural presence. Most shows, even the best of them, tend to have a strong season, maybe 2 or 3, and then they get milked out of existence in my mind. Like every season gets a little worse, a little more jam-packed with filler, a little less, plot relevant, a little more jumping the shark. Speaking of jumping the shark, maybe Happy Days had a big finale, I'm not sure. But most shows go downhill generously after season 3. So my point being, by the time most shows get to a finale, the show has already fallen apart. It has largely fallen out of cultural favor to begin with.
it's just not, it's not set up to have a giant finale. Stranger Things kind of bucked this trend, right? For one thing, it only had 5 seasons total, with pretty long breaks in between some of those seasons. I can't remember how long of a break it was between seasons, say 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, but by the time we got to 4 and 5, there were substantial gaps in time. Like actual, real world time. 3 years, I think. We waited 3.5 between season 4 and 5. Like they are long gaps for a show. These are not yearly shows with 24 episodes to fill time. These were 8 or 9 episodes released every 2 to 3 years. So it only went to season 5. So it didn't have, in some ways, it didn't have the time to really just, end up out in left field somewhere. In some ways, it is pretty impressive that the show managed to kind of keep its momentum the way it did. I think if you go back and watch season 1, it's pretty clear it was never meant to be this kind of cinematic cultural phenomenon. It was a fun little story set in sort of a fantasy / realistic kind of world with a lot of nostalgia bait. And this was at a time, I don't know if it's fair to say that this show kind of kicked off 80s nostalgia, but it certainly solidified it, right? And since this show, which I forget when it aired, if it was 2016 or 2015 or something, since it originally aired, the shows that try to take advantage of nostalgia bait have skyrocketed, right? There are many, many more of them than there used to be. And I think that this show was really a catalyst for that, or a proof of concept for that. The other thing, so that was one thing, just about shows in general, right? Most shows just don't get to a place where they can actually do a finale like this, where anybody cares, right? The other thing that I would say is that it's impossible. From a creator's standpoint, it is impossible to actually do this in a way that would satisfy all of your fan base. It's just not realistic. And we've seen this to varying extents. And I'm not going to say well, let me jump ahead. I think that the finale of Stranger Things was okay. I don't think it was horrible. I don't think it was a giant disappointment. I don't think that it puts a scar on the legacy of the show. I don't think any of those things. I just think it was okay with a few flaws, right? And I think that some of the flaws were they smell sort of like studio constraints or budget constraints or something. But I think it did some things well too, and I think it took a few risks as well. Like some of it was very safe feeling, and some of it, I think they did take a few narrative risks that, are worth commending. But if you look at some of these other shows, like, I think Game of Thrones is the one that really, like, the finale, the whole last season, but certainly the finale, the way the show wrapped up in Game of Thrones was so bad, so offensively terrible, that it effectively killed the show for its fandom. I mean, Game of Thrones was the show for quite a while, and it had an enormous fan base, very dedicated to it. And the finale was so bad that after that last season was done, I almost felt like the criticism wasn't even that bad because it was just like unspoken. At least in the circles that I kind of bumped into at that time, it just faded into nothing. It was like everyone collectively and unconsciously was like, okay, let's just never speak of this again, right? That's what it felt like. It was that horrible. And this certainly was not that. I would even, and Sopranos was another example of a finale that really kind of rubbed pretty much everyone the wrong way. I'm kind of in the minority on that one. The story with one of the things about The Sopranos is the creator tried to stop that show several times, and they kept throwing more money at him to keep it going. So by the time it got to the end, I just think all the good ideas were kind of gone. Like, there wasn't much left to do. And so, the way they wrapped it up was like, it was okay. It wasn't okay. If I'm describing Stranger Things as okay, I can't describe Sopranos as okay. It was sub-okay. It was below okay. But it wasn't, again, it didn't reach the offensive levels that Game of Thrones did. I don't think under the best of circumstances, Stranger Things could have wrapped things up in a way that I think that the hype for Stranger Things had gotten too big for what it actually was, to actually effectively wrap up the show, because it had become almost this, at least for people, maybe, I don't know what it's like necessarily for kids or for younger generations, but for older generations, people in their 40s, 50s, something like that, I think it became like a portal into a time that never fully existed, but that everyone kind of wanted to rewind to. Like, they had done the nostalgia so effectively that I think people started placing their hopes and dreams on this show about a girl with magic powers, right? It became way more than it actually was, which is great for the show, but makes it very difficult to please the fandom. And by the time season 5 had rolled around, the cast had gotten very large, and there were a lot of plot lines that hadn't been wrapped up or even adequately set up to be wrapped up. And so there was always no matter how you wrap this thing up, it was going to have certain criticism around, well, what about this plot line and what about that plot line? So I'm willing to put all of that aside and just talk about the episodes in the last season for what they were, for what actually got committed to screen. Putting aside some of the build-up, putting aside, the cultural pieces, putting aside the open plot lines. I'm going to talk about it from that angle. I'm going to give two main criticisms and one thing that I think was sort of a bold move, but they kind of all wrap together in some ways. My main criticism, the main thing that I think in a vacuum, no matter how I slice it, no matter how I piece it together in my head, the ending battle sequence, the big boss fight, was just too short and too easy and didn't feel like it had enough weight or enough movements behind it. And what I mean by movements is, one side has the upper hand, then the other side gets the upper hand, then one other side gets the upper hand, like that sort of back and forth. It just didn't feel like it had much of that. It felt like it was a little too easy for the protagonists, and it just felt too fast. With something that had been going on as long as it had, with some of the build-up that they had done in terms of plot for some of these villains, I just felt like it wrapped up too quickly. Sort of a sub-complaint there is that I feel like the creators couldn't decide, ultimately, whether the big bad was Vecna or whether the big bad was the Mind Flayer. And I feel like they punted on that and just went with a throwaway line that was like, "We are one," right? And that didn't land for me, but that's sort of a sub thing. The main thing is I think the big battle should have been a bigger climax. The other thing, and what plays into that, is that my second kind of criticism is I feel like the grouping of episodes was awkward. And I kind of get it, right? It almost feels like it wasn't originally designed to have a standalone finale where like the final episode was released on, for those of you, maybe listening to this later or whatever, the whole thing was released on New Year's Eve. The final episode, it was 2 hours long. The problem is it felt like two totally different episodes. There was an episode with a final battle, and then there was an hour-long episode, almost an hour, I think it was more like 45 minutes, where they sort of wrapped up plot lines for characters. And that, not to mix this too bad, but that was my main thing that I thought was brave that they did, sort of, was their last episode was not action-oriented. It was not any of that. It was really an exploration of how the characters wrapped up, and I liked that. I thought that was good. It went on for a little long. I think they could have trimmed 15 minutes out of that and maybe added 15 minutes to the battle instead. But for what it was pretty good. I thought that was a brave choice. But the whole thing felt a little bit like studio interference because, for example, I think it would have landed better for me, not perfectly, but better, if episodes 7 and 8 were together in a 3-hour finale, because episode 7 had quite a bit of like action-oriented build-up and impact and that kind of stuff. And I think that if you put 7 and 8 together, that final action sequence would feel like more of a payoff because you would have been spending plenty of time initially during episode 7 with all the buildup, and it would have felt more cohesive. As it stood, to have episode 7 be kind of a standalone thing, and then to not wrap it up till 8, like a week later, it felt like an interruption, and not in a good way. And so you had this episode 7 that was like a great setup, and then you had 8, which felt like a rushed battle and a character wrap-up that were two different things. So I think that's part of it. So I could have seen, I wonder if there was a world where initially this was either supposed to be a 3-hour finale where 7 and 8 were together, or a world where the last 4 episodes, 5, 6, 7, 8, were all supposed to drop at once so you could binge your way through it. And possibly even have a 9th episode where it was just character wrap up. But then if you could imagine a world where a studio might have walked in and said, we need a big finale, and all this stuff was already put together, and they're like, how do we chop this up to give the audience a 2-hour finale at the end? And the only option was take the last essentially 2 episodes that are not thematically similar, group them together and release them in a 2-hour chunk. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I could definitely see it feels like that to me. Despite all these things, I will always have a very special and fond place in my heart for this show for a couple of reasons. And by the way, one of them isn't really nostalgia. Like, I think it's been kind of like widely shown that a lot of these shows and other things that rely on nostalgia, it's largely fake nostalgia. Like, things didn't really exist in the way that they depict them here. But for me, it's like a double layer of fake nostalgia because, first of all, there's that, right? The fact that these are not representing the true state of things in like the 80s. Pieces of it are real, but it's really, you watch these shows and you think that all it was people running around with like Rubik's Cubes and bike riding. Like, it's not how the 80s really, truly were. But the other thing for me is that I wasn't really a child of the 80s. Like, I was born in the 80s, but I was mostly a child of the 90s, right? So for me, it's almost like things like this trick me into feeling like I was part of something that I wasn't. right? Like, I remember some of this stuff because some of it went into the 90s too, and some of it, I do remember from a very early childhood, but largely I grew up in the 90s, not the 80s. So for me, it's almost like double fake nostalgia. So my point in saying that is that, like, the special place in my heart is not because I connect super deeply to the nostalgia of the show. I will remember this fondly for two main reasons. And by fondly, I mean, like, this will hold a special place in my heart for two reasons. One thing it did was it brought the game of Dungeons and Dragons into the popular zeitgeist in a way that I never would have imagined was possible. Never would have imagined it. Growing up, I, throughout a good chunk of my childhood, played D&D with various people. And it was something to be, like, hidden and ashamed of. Like, it was the dorkiest of dorky hobbies, right? And it was not a thing that you went around telling people you did, at least in my area, or that you had school clubs for, or anything else. And so even as certain other very geeky, dorky, hobbies over the years have become much more mainstream, things like Magic the Gathering, video games, that sort of stuff that was also at the time pretty nerdy, D&D never really took that leap. It was just the bridge too far. It's this, like, sit down with a pen and paper and talk about your wisdom statistic, Like, it was just the bridge too far, generally speaking. And while it has taken strides over the years, this show really pushed it out in a way that now, if you talk about it, people have some concept of what it is, even if they've never experienced it themselves. So from just kind of a hobbyist and personal hobby kind of angle, I think this show did good there. But the other reason that this will forever hold an extremely special place in my heart was because we had put off for years showing this show to the kids. Not necessarily because of the content. Like, yeah, there's some gory content, but on, rewatches, like, it's not too bad from a content perspective. I don't think, generally speaking, this show is going to be running around giving anybody nightmares. But it was more from you won't understand the context because it was so based in the 80s, and because it was so, there was a lot of, like, kind of teenage level, kind of world, and our kids were still pretty young. We put it off and put it off and put it off. And then this year, or earlier in the year 2025, I guess, we decided, the kids had gotten old enough, and we were like, okay, let's watch the whole thing, and they loved it, right? So by the time season 5 rolled around, they had seen the first 4 seasons. Not only had they seen them, they loved it. They had gotten really into it. They were, like, theory crafting about what was going to happen in season 5. And this was the first sort of cultural phenomenon show that really went like that. And we, my wife and I, got to share that with the kids. And so we threw, like, a big viewing party for, in particular, the first part of season 5. And then the finale, we had some of their friends over on New Year's Eve, and we did a big viewing party. And, it was the type of event that, I'm not sure I don't remember ever doing that with my parents, having, like, a TV show that we all really sat down and were super into, and, like, was a huge part of the cultural, zeitgeist, and had become this phenomenon, and, like, everyone was super into, right? Because for every bit as into this show as, like, my wife and I were, the kids were, like, at least that much, if not more. And for, like, a few weeks in the year 2025, as we wrapped things to a close and went through the holidays, we had a chance to share something truly culturally significant even if it's silly, right? Even if it's just a TV show about some kids with magic powers and D&D, right? But it was something that really, like, I'll have that forever. And I hope that they do too, right? But again, I think that the content in the show was okay. Like the finale itself, for what it was a reasonable way to wrap up a show. Do I have criticisms? Yeah, sure. I think you could have criticisms about almost anything. But this will hold such a uniquely special place for me forever because of how significant the culture was around it, and because of just how much it meant as just a small, family unit to kind of be part of and be there for and go in on. I remember the only thing that came close in my life that I can think of, and it's not anywhere near it, but there was the original run of Avatar, The Last Airbender, the show that was on Nickelodeon. I didn't even watch the show, but at the time that the finale rolled around, someone in sort of my social group had been a big fan. And we threw a viewing party for that. And I remember watching the finale and being like, oh, this is like really cool. And there was like 12 people in the room. And I felt really part of something, even though I'd never even watched the show. Like, I had never watched it. And I went back years later and watched it because it was really a very good show. But I wasn't even part of the culture around this show. And it wasn't even as big of a show as Stranger Things had become. But I still felt like part of something, like something kind of special during that like finale viewing party. And in this case, we got to throw something like that, with the kids in our family for something that like no one was dragging their feet through this. Everyone was excited. And that really made it special and fun. So regardless of how this show wrapped up and whether or not it had become too hyped for its own feasibility, or whether or not there were plot holes or anything else, the fact that something like this brought us together during a time in the world when it is so easy to be kind of distant and separated was really something worth commending. And that's worth much more than whether or not a final battle goes 15 minutes too short, or whether a character arc goes 15 minutes too long, or how they group episodes 7 and 8, or anything else. So this will live in infamy, at least in my own head, about how much it meant to the people I was around at that time. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure you could put a higher accolade onto any piece of art, whether it's writing or painting or a movie or a TV show. I think the ability to really be something special to even a small group of people, that's what art's all about, I think, at the end of the day. And I think the world needs more experiences like that. And so I give the highest commendations and the highest accolades that some random guy on a podcast can give, simply because I think that regardless of the intricacy or the implementation details of this specific thing, at the very least, it with flying colors achieved what art really is supposed to, or what art aspires to achieve in a way that very few things do.